Main Street in Pine Ridge, Pennsylvania. Population 4,782. A town where American flags hang from porch columns and everyone knows which church you attend. The narrator's voice is measured, documentary perfect. On April 17, 2023, at approximately 11:42 p.m., the Pine Ridge Police Department received a 911 call from room 14 at the Pine Ridge Motel. The screen shows police lights reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. Yellow crime scene tape flutters in the wind. The caller was James Mercer, a 45-year-old local business owner. His statement was brief. "I killed my wife. She's not who she said she was." We see James Mercer's booking photo, a man with hollow eyes and 3-day stubble, looking directly at the camera as if challenging the viewer to understand. To comprehend what led to this moment, we need to go back 3 years earlier, when James Mercer, widowed for 2 years after losing his first wife to cancer, met Diane Collins at a real estate convention in Philadelphia. Archive footage shows downtown Pine Ridge 3 years earlier. The hardware store with Mercer's Hardware serving Pine Ridge. Since 1,978 inches painted on the window. Inside, James helps customers, his movements efficient, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. James inherited Mercer's hardware from his father. By all accounts, he was respected in Pine Ridge, a Chamber of Commerce member, Little League coach, and deacon at First Presbyterian. The documentary cuts to an interview with Hank Dawson, 60s, wearing a Pine Ridge Volunteer Fire Department cap. James was always solid, the kind of guy you could count on. After Mary died, that was his first wife, he threw himself into work. We were all glad when he met Diane. Seemed like he was finally coming back to life. Another interview. Betty Willard, town librarian, 50s, pearl necklace. Diane was from Philadelphia originally. Sophisticated, you know. Beautiful woman, impeccable taste. She came to town to open a branch office for Keystone Realty. Within 6 months, she was their top seller. People trusted her. Wedding photos flash across the screen, James in a dark suit. Diane in an elegant cream-colored dress, cutting cake at the Pine Ridge Country Club. They married after dating for 9 months. According to friends, they seemed perfectly matched. Both successful professionals, both private people. The documentary transitions to Thomas Blake sitting in a dimly lit room, his face partially shadowed. He speaks with a Philadelphia accent, occasionally glancing away from the camera. "I hadn't spoken to Diane in almost 15 years. We had a falling out. Family stuff, you know? But I was in a rough spot financially. Medical bills piling up. I tracked her down to Pine Ridge." The camera shows Thomas arriving in Pine Ridge, parking his weathered Toyota outside Keystone Realty. Through the window, we see Diane at her desk, her posture freezing when she notices Thomas. "When Diane saw me, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She took me to lunch at the diner across the street, but she wouldn't talk there. Too many people who knew her. We went to the park instead." Security camera footage from Pine Ridge Park shows Diane and Thomas sitting on a bench, their conversation clearly tense. Officer Sarah Henderson narrates over the footage. According to Thomas Blake's statement, Diane refused to help him financially. She said she'd built a new life and didn't want any connections to her past. That's when Thomas threatened to tell her husband everything. Thomas continues his interview. "I needed that money. I was desperate. So I told her if she wouldn't help family, maybe her husband would want to know who he really married." The documentary cuts to James Mercer at his hardware store later that day. Security footage shows Thomas entering, looking around, then approaching James at the counter. "I didn't know what to expect when I went to see him," Thomas says in voiceover. "I just knew I needed money, and Diane, or Daniel, as I knew him growing up, wasn't going to help." The security footage has no audio, but we see James's expression change dramatically as Thomas speaks. The color drains from his face. He grips the counter. Dr. Eleanor Wright, town therapist, appears on screen in her office. In small communities like Pine Ridge, identity is often tied to conformity and tradition. Learning that someone close to you has concealed something fundamental about themselves can trigger a profound identity crisis, especially for someone like James who valued honesty above all else. The documentary returns to James, now closing his store early. The open sign flipped to closed at 3:17 p.m., according to the timestamp. He sits in his truck in the parking lot for 22 minutes before driving away. That evening, according to cell phone records, James made 3 calls to Diane. All went unanswered. We see James enter their 2-story colonial home. Lights go on upstairs, then downstairs. More security footage shows him accessing their home computer, searching through Diane's email accounts, her dresser drawers, her closet. Officer Henderson continues, James Mercer's search history from that evening shows multiple queries about gender reassignment surgery, legal name changes in Pennsylvania, and whether marriages could be annulled due to fraud. The documentary shows James sitting alone in their kitchen at 2 a.m., drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, surrounded by photo albums of their life together. The next morning, James called in sick to the hardware store, something his employees said he had never done before. He then drove to the county records office in Lancaster. Footage shows James at the records office, requesting documents, his movements increasingly agitated. By evening, James had compiled what he believed was evidence confirming Thomas Blake's claims. When Diane returned home from work, security footage from their doorbell camera captured their first confrontation. The grainy doorbell footage shows Diane arriving home at 6:42 p.m. James meets her at the door, holding papers. Their conversation quickly becomes heated. Diane covers her face with her hands, then pushes past him into the house. The front door slams shut. Dr. Wright appears again. For James, this wasn't just about Diane's gender history. In his mind, it was about 3 years of perceived deception. Every memory, every intimate moment was suddenly being recontextualized through this new information. The documentary cuts to more recent footage. James, in prison clothes, sitting behind glass in the visitation room at Northeast Correctional Facility. I loved who I thought she was, he says, his voice flat. Finding out our whole marriage was built on a lie. It was like she died, and this stranger had been living in my house all along. The camera returns to Pine Ridge, to the Mercer house, now with a for sale sign on the lawn. In the week that followed this revelation, James Mercer would begin a psychological descent that would ultimately end in tragedy at the Pine Ridge Motel. Mercer House at dawn, the morning after the confrontation. Lights are on despite the early hour. The narrator's voice returns, somber and measured. According to neighbors, shouting could be heard from the Mercer residence until approximately 2 a.m. At 5:47 a.m., security cameras captured Diane Mercer leaving the house with a small overnight bag. She drove to the Pine Ridge Inn, where she checked in for one night. The footage shows Diane at the reception desk, her normally immaculate appearance disheveled, sunglasses covering her eyes despite the early hour. Martha Jenkins, the night manager at the Pine Ridge Inn, appears on screen in her uniform. She seemed upset, but holding it together, Asked for a room on the back side of the building, away from the street, paid in cash, which was unusual for folks from town. The documentary cuts to James, sitting alone in their kitchen, still in the same clothes from the night before. The timestamp reads 7:23 a.m. That morning, James Mercer made a call to Dr. Eleanor Wright, the town's only licensed therapist. Phone records show the call lasted less than 2 minutes. Dr. Wright appears on screen again, looking uncomfortable with the question posed to her. I can't discuss specific details of any conversations with James due to confidentiality. What I can say is that he requested an emergency appointment, which I scheduled for later that afternoon. The documentary shows James arriving at Dr. Wright's office at 2 p.m., parking his truck haphazardly across 2 spaces. He enters the building, his shoulders hunched, a manila folder clutched in his hand. While James was meeting with Dr. Wright, Diane was reaching out to her own support system. Cell phone records show multiple calls to a number in Philadelphia, registered to Patricia Alvarez, identified in Diane's contacts as Patty Support Group. Patricia Alvarez appears on screen, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair, sitting in what appears to be a community center meeting room. Diane and I met at a transgender support group in Philadelphia about 8 years ago. Before she moved to Pine Ridge, we stayed in touch. When she called me that day, she was terrified, not just for herself, but for her marriage, her career, everything she'd built in that town. Patricia looks down, composing herself before continuing. She told me James had found out about her past. She said he kept using the word lied over and over during their fight. She didn't know if it was safe to go home. The documentary cuts to a legal expert, Professor Meredith Chen from Penn State School of Law. There's no legal requirement for transgender individuals to disclose their gender history to potential spouses in Pennsylvania. However, this area remains complicated from both legal and ethical perspectives. Marriage is built on trust, and different people have different expectations about what information should be shared before marriage. Back to Patricia Alvarez. Diane always feared this day would come. She'd tell me, "I just want to live my life, Patty. I don't want to be a transgender real estate agent, just a real estate agent." She was deeply private about her transition. The documentary shows security footage from Keystone Realty, where Diane worked. She's seen at her desk, taking a call, then abruptly leaving, telling a colleague something before rushing out the door. Linda Parsons, Diane's colleague, appears on screen. She came in looking terrible that morning. I asked if she was okay, and she just said she had a rough night. Around noon, she got a call and practically ran out, said it was a family emergency. The timestamp shows Diane leaving the office at 12:17 p.m. Traffic cameras capture her car driving toward the north side of town in the direction of Pine Ridge Park. According to multiple sources, Diane met with Thomas Blake at Pine Ridge Park that afternoon. A witness who was walking her dog nearby reported that the conversation appeared heated. The witness, an elderly woman who requested anonymity, speaks with her face blurred. The woman seemed very upset with the man, kept jabbing her finger at him, saying something like, "You've destroyed everything." I moved on because it seemed private, but I could hear them arguing even from a distance. The documentary returns to Thomas Blake's interview. "Yeah, we met up again. Diane was furious. Said James knew everything now and their marriage was falling apart. She blamed me, but what was I supposed to do? I needed help." Thomas shifts uncomfortably in his seat, defensive. "She kept saying I'd ruined her life for money, but it wasn't like that. I just thought her husband deserved to know the truth." Officer Sarah Henderson reappears on screen, reviewing a case file. "We have evidence that money changed hands during this meeting. Diane withdrew $5,000 from her personal account that morning, and Thomas Blake deposited $4,700 into his account in Philadelphia the next day." The documentary shows Diane returning to the Pine Ridge Inn at 3:42 p.m., visibly distraught. Meanwhile, James is seen leaving Dr. Wright's office at 3:50 p.m., his expression unreadable. The documentary cuts to James driving directly from Dr. Wright's office to the Rusty Nail, a local bar on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. Security footage shows him entering at 4:12 p.m. and taking a seat at the far end of the bar. Ray Donovan, the bartender, appears on screen. James wasn't a big drinker, maybe a beer after softball games with the guys. But that day, he ordered whiskey. Double. Then another. He was staring at his phone the whole time, scrolling through something. Pictures, I think. The footage shows James growing increasingly agitated as he drinks, sometimes showing his phone screen to the bartender, who appears uncomfortable. He kept saying, "Look at this. Look. Would you have known?" I didn't know what he was talking about at first. Then he started saying stuff about his wife. Personal stuff. I tried to change the subject, but he was fixated. The camera returns to James's booking photo, then cuts to Officer Henderson. We later recovered James's phone. His search history from that afternoon included phrases like signs of transgender, how to tell if someone was born male, and can you annul a marriage for fraud in Pennsylvania. He was also looking at old photos of Diane, zooming in on her features. The documentary shows James leaving the bar at 7:28 p.m., noticeably intoxicated. Despite his condition, he gets into his truck and drives away. Cell phone tower data places James's phone near the Pine Ridge Inn at approximately 8 p.m. that evening. However, there's no evidence he attempted to enter the building or contact Diane. The footage shows James's truck parked across the street from the inn, headlights off, for nearly an hour before departing. Patricia Alvarez returns to the screen. Diane called me again that night. She said James had been texting her all evening, alternating between apologizing and demanding explanations. She was planning to stay at the inn one more night, then drive to Philadelphia the next day to stay with me while they figured things out. The documentary shows text messages appearing on screen. James, 6:42 p.m. Why didn't you tell me before we got married? Diane, 6:45 p.m. I was afraid of losing you. I'm still the same person you fell in love with. James, 7:03 p.m. Were you ever going to tell me? Or was I just going to live my whole life not knowing? Diane, 7:10 p.m. Can we please talk about this in person when we're both calmer? I love you, James. James, 8:32 p.m. Did you laugh at me behind my back? Did everyone know but me? Diane, 8:33 p.m. No one knows. This is my private business. I've been living as Diane since I was 25. James, 9:47 p.m. I keep thinking about our wedding night, about everything. Was it all a lie? Diane, 9:50 p.m. Nothing about my love for you was a lie. Please believe that. The documentary transitions to the next morning. Diane is seen checking out of the Pine Ridge Inn at 9:15 a.m. Linda Parsons reappears. Diane called the office to say she needed a personal day. She sounded exhausted, said she had a family situation to deal with and might need to take the rest of the week off. The camera shows Diane loading her overnight bag into her car, then pausing to take a call on her cell phone. Her body language changes dramatically during the conversation, her shoulders tensing, her free hand gripping the car door. Officer Henderson. According to phone records, that call came from Thomas Blake. It lasted approximately 3 minutes. Thomas Blake returns to the screen. I called to check on her, honestly. Things had gotten intense the day before. She told me James knew everything and was falling apart. She said she was heading to Philadelphia for a while and asked me not to contact James again. The documentary cuts to James at Mercer's Hardware later that morning. Security footage shows him moving mechanically through the store, his interactions with customers notably brief. At 11:23 a.m., security cameras captured James taking a call in his office at the back of the store. The call lasted just over 4 minutes. Officer Henderson continues. That call came from a burner phone purchased that morning at a gas station outside Pine Ridge. We believe the caller was Thomas Blake, though he denies this. Whatever was said during that conversation prompted James to immediately close the store, turning away customers and putting up a family emergency sign. The footage shows James rushing out of the store at 11:30 a.m., almost running to his truck. Traffic cameras track James's vehicle heading toward the highway that leads to Philadelphia. At 11:42 a.m., he called Diane's cell phone. The call went unanswered. The documentary shows a map of cell phone tower pings, tracking both James and Diane's movements. At 12:15 p.m., Diane's phone pinged at a tower near exit 47, approximately halfway between Pine Ridge and Philadelphia. 2 minutes later, James's phone pinged at the same tower. Officer Henderson. Based on our reconstruction, James must have been driving well over the speed limit to catch up to Diane so quickly. We believe he spotted her car at the Rest Easy Travel Center just off exit 47. Security footage from the Rest Easy shows Diane's car parked near the main building. Moments later, James's truck pulls into the lot, parking haphazardly across 2 spaces. James is seen exiting his vehicle and scanning the area before spotting Diane through the large windows of the Travel Center's cafe. The security cameras inside the Rest Easy captured James confronting Diane at her table. Though there's no audio, the conversation appears immediately tense. The silent footage shows James standing over Diane, gesturing angrily. Other patrons begin to notice the confrontation. Diane repeatedly shakes her head, then stands to leave. James grabs her arm. A security guard approaches, and James releases her. Diane quickly exits the building with James following. A truck driver identified as Ed Wilson appears on screen. I was having coffee when this guy comes storming in, heads straight for this woman sitting alone. They started arguing right away. She kept trying to keep it down, but he was getting louder. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her pretty rough. That's when the security guy stepped in. The security footage continues outside, showing Diane hurrying to her car with James still following, still talking. She turns to face him in the parking lot. They speak for several minutes, their body language gradually becoming less confrontational. Officer Henderson. According to witnesses, they continued talking for nearly 15 minutes. Eventually, they appeared to reach some kind of agreement. Diane was seen nodding repeatedly, then checking her phone. The footage shows Diane showing James something on her phone screen. He looks at it, then back at her. They talk for another minute before James returns to his truck. Diane remains standing in the parking lot, watching him leave. Cell tower data shows both phones leaving the rest stop area within 10 minutes of each other, both heading back in the direction of Pine Ridge rather than continuing toward Philadelphia. The documentary shows both vehicles arriving back in Pine Ridge in the early afternoon. James returns to the hardware store. Diane drives to the Pine Ridge Motel, a different establishment from the inn where she'd stayed the previous night. The Pine Ridge Motel is located on the outskirts of town. It offers weekly rates and is primarily used by long-haul truckers and temporary workers. It's significant that Diane chose this location rather than returning to the Pine Ridge Inn. Surveillance footage shows Diane checking into the motel at 2:17 p.m., paying cash for a 3-night stay. She's assigned to room 14. Thomas Blake reappears. She called me from the motel, said James had intercepted her on the way to Philadelphia, said he'd convinced her to stay in town so they could work things out. She didn't sound convinced it was a good idea, but she said she owed him at least that much. The documentary cuts to James closing up the hardware store at 5 p.m., his movements deliberate and controlled, a stark contrast to his frantic behavior earlier in the day. At 6:05 p.m., James purchased a fifth of whiskey from Decker's liquor store. At 6:37 p.m., security cameras at the Pine Ridge Pharmacy captured him buying a package of razor blades and a roll of duct tape. Officer Henderson looks directly at the camera. The cashier remembered James because he seemed unusually focused on such ordinary purchases. She described him as too calm, like someone holding himself together by a thread. The documentary shows James driving to the motel, arriving at 7:22 p.m. He parks his truck at the far end of the lot, out of direct view of the office. He sits in the vehicle for nearly 20 minutes before exiting with a small duffel bag and walking toward room 14. The Pine Ridge Motel's security system was outdated, with cameras only at the office and parking lot entrances. Once James walked toward the room blocks, he was no longer visible on any surveillance footage. The documentary cuts to a text message exchange, time-stamped from that evening. Diane, 7:15 p.m. I'm in room 14. We can talk when you're ready. James, 7:18 p.m. I'll be there soon. We have a lot to figure out. Diane, 7:19 p.m. I know you're angry. I'm prepared to answer any questions you have. James, 7:20 p.m. Just one question. Was any of it real? The documentary fades to black momentarily, then returns with a 911 call recording playing over an exterior shot of the motel at night. Police lights reflecting off the windows. Dispatcher, 911, what's your emergency? James, voice flat, emotionless. I need to report a murder at the Pine Ridge Motel, room 14. Dispatcher, sir, who's been hurt? James, my wife, Diane Mercer, I killed her. Dispatcher, sir, are you still at the location? James, yes, room 14, I'll be waiting. The screen fades to black again as the narrator speaks. What exactly transpired in room 14 between 7:45 p.m. and 11:42 p.m. when James Mercer called 911 would soon become the center of a criminal investigation that would divide the town of Pine Ridge. Flashing police lights illuminating the Pine Ridge Motel's weathered sign. Officer Sarah Henderson narrates as body camera footage shows police arriving at room 14. First responders arrived at 11:51 p.m., 9 minutes after James Mercer's 911 call. What they found inside that room would haunt even our most experienced officers. The body camera footage shows James sitting calmly in a chair by the window, his hands resting on his knees, covered in blood. On the bed lies Diane, surrounded by a dark pool that has soaked through the mattress. James Mercer offered no resistance. According to the arresting officers, his first words were, "She lied to me every day for 3 years." The documentary cuts to Dr. Eleanor Wright, who chooses her words carefully. When someone's sense of reality is shattered, they can enter what we call a dissociative state, a psychological distance from their actions. The calm that witnesses described isn't peace. It's the mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable truth. The footage shows James being led to a police car, his expression blank as neighbors from nearby rooms watch, some filming with their phones. News of the murder spread through Pine Ridge before dawn. By morning, the revelation about Diane's transgender status had followed, creating a dual shockwave through the community. The documentary cuts to earlier that day, showing James's increasingly erratic behavior leading up to the murder. Security footage from Mercer's hardware captures James in his office around 3 p.m., making a series of phone calls. Officer Henderson provides context. Phone records show he called his insurance agent to verify his life insurance policy remained in force. He then called his sister in Ohio, speaking for nearly 12 minutes. James's sister, Karen Whitfield, appears on screen, visibly distressed. He wasn't making much sense, kept saying his life was a lie, that he'd been humiliated. I asked if he'd been drinking. He said he was perfectly clear-headed for the first time in years. That scared me more than if he'd been drunk. The documentary shows Karen immediately calling the Pine Ridge Police Department after hanging up with James. The timestamp on the call log reads 3:27 p.m. Karen Whitfield reported her concerns to Officer Miguel Rodriguez, who made a note but determined there wasn't enough evidence of imminent danger to warrant immediate intervention. Officer Rodriguez appears on screen, the weight of hindsight evident in his expression. "We get calls about family disputes all the time. She said her brother was upset about marital problems. Nothing he reportedly said indicated specific threats or self-harm plans. In retrospect..." His voice trails off, unable to complete the thought. The documentary cuts to Thomas Blake being interviewed at a coffee shop in Philadelphia 3 days after the murder. "I never thought it would go this far. Never. I just wanted some financial help. And when Diane refused, I thought James deserved to know why his wife was so secretive about her past. How was I supposed to know he'd..." Thomas looks away from the camera, wiping his eyes. The documentary transitions to footage of Thomas's last phone call to Diane, the one she received in the motel room just hours before James arrived. According to phone records, this call lasted nearly 15 minutes. Thomas Blake initially denied making this call when questioned by police. Thomas looks directly into the camera, defensive. "I called to apologize, okay? I felt terrible about everything. She told me James was coming over that night to talk. She thought they might work things out. Said he seemed calmer after their meeting at the rest stop." The documentary shows security footage from a liquor store where James purchased whiskey, his movements methodical and controlled. Dr. Wright provides analysis. This methodical behavior, the liquor store, the pharmacy purchases, suggests premeditation. Yet the items he purchased could also be interpreted more benignly. This ambiguity often complicates our understanding of crimes of passion. The footage transitions to James's truck parked at the Pine Ridge Motel at 7:40 p.m. He sits inside for 20 minutes, occasionally drinking from the bottle of whiskey, before finally exiting with a small duffel bag. The contents of that bag would later become key evidence in the prosecution's case against James Mercer. The documentary cuts to crime scene photos, carefully edited to show only the doorway to room 14, with evidence markers placed around a broken lamp and overturned chair. Officer Henderson explains, "The physical evidence told a story of escalation. The conversation began calmly, 2 water glasses on the table, chairs positioned for discussion. Then something triggered a violent response. The forensic examiner, Dr. Maya Patel, appears on screen looking at photographs. The blood spatter analysis indicates the initial attack occurred near the bathroom door. The victim retreated toward the bed, with defensive wounds on her arms and hands. The fatal wounds were inflicted while she was already fallen on the bed." The documentary shows a timeline appearing on screen, constructed from various evidence sources. 7:45 p.m. James arrives at room 14746 to 9:30 p.m. James and Diane talk, estimated time frame, 9:30 to 10:15 p.m. Confrontation escalates, based on noise reports from adjacent rooms, 10:15 to 11:40 p.m. Period of silence, 11:42 p.m. James calls 911. What happened during those silent 85 minutes between the end of the audible confrontation and James's 911 call remains unknown. James Mercer has never provided a detailed account of those moments. The documentary cuts to a preliminary hearing where James sits expressionless as the charges are read. First-degree murder with special circumstances. District Attorney Melinda Hargrove speaks to reporters outside the courthouse. This was not a crime of sudden passion. Mr. Mercer had nearly 24 hours to process his feelings. Instead of seeking help, He made a series of deliberate choices that culminated in taking another person's life. The defense attorney, Richard Galloway, offers a counterpoint. My client experienced an extreme emotional trauma. His entire reality was upended. The prosecution's timeline conveniently ignores the profound psychological crisis Mr. Mercer was experiencing. The documentary returns to Dr. Wright, who speaks about the psychological dynamics at play. From a clinical perspective, we're seeing a collision of identity crisis, perceived betrayal, and toxic masculinity. Some men are socialized to respond to emotional wounds with anger rather than vulnerability. The screen shows social media posts from Pine Ridge residents, revealing a town deeply divided over the case. User 1. Nobody has the right to hide something that important from their spouse. Still doesn't justify murder. User 2. James was the victim of a massive deception. Any man would have snapped. User 3. Diane lived her truth. She didn't owe anyone her personal history. User 4. This isn't about transgender issues. It's about honesty in marriage. Patricia Alvarez returns to the screen, tearful but resolute. Diane lived in fear of exactly this reaction. Trans women, especially in small communities, face impossible choices. Be open and risk rejection or violence from the start, or build a life where you're seen for who you truly are. Knowing discovery could destroy everything. The documentary cuts to a vigil held for Diane in Philadelphia, attended by members of her former support group. Candles illuminate photographs of her smiling, alive. Officer Henderson provides the final narration of this chapter. As investigators, we deal in evidence, not emotions. The evidence tells us James Mercer made a series of decisions that night. He chose to bring duct tape and razor blades to that motel room. He chose to use them, and when it was over, he chose to call 911 and confess rather than flee. The documentary fades to black as the narrator speaks. The decisions made in room 14 of the Pine Ridge Motel would reverberate far beyond one small Pennsylvania town, raising profound questions about identity, deception, and the limits of understanding between two people who once promised to love each other forever. Aerial footage of Pine Ridge at dawn, a small town awakening to irrevocably altered reality. Police tape surrounds the Pine Ridge Motel as forensic teams continue their work. The narrator's voice is solemn. The morning after Diane Mercer's murder, Pine Ridge found itself at the center of a story that would soon capture national attention. Not just because of the shocking violence that had occurred in room 14, but because of the questions it raised about identity, disclosure, and the boundaries of trust. The documentary cuts to the Pine Ridge police station, where James Mercer sits in an interrogation room. The timestamp reads 3:17 a.m. He stares straight ahead, his bloody clothes now replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Detective Robert Collins sits across from him, a recording device between them. For the record, you've been advised of your rights and have chosen to speak without an attorney present. Is that correct? Detective Collins asks. James nods, then says flatly, yes. Can you tell me what happened at the motel tonight? James looks directly at the camera, his eyes empty. I killed the person I thought was my wife. The documentary transitions to crime scene investigators methodically processing room 14. Close-ups show blood spatter analysis, fingerprint dusting, and evidence collection. A razor blade in a sealed evidence bag is labeled and photographed. Officer Henderson narrates, the medical examiner determined Diane Mercer died from multiple lacerations to the neck and torso. The primary weapon was a standard razor blade, available at any pharmacy. The wounds indicated both precision and rage. Some were methodical, others frenzied. The documentary cuts to Dr. Eleanor Wright. In cases of extreme emotional trauma, we sometimes see this duality in violence. Moments of cold calculation interrupted by bursts of uncontrolled fury. It's as if two different people are committing the act. The screen shows the contents of James's duffel bag laid out on an evidence table. Duct tape, razor blades, a change of clothes, their wedding photo with Diane's face scratched out, and a handwritten letter. Officer Henderson continues, the letter was addressed to his sister Karen. It read, in part, I can't live with this deception. Either way, by the time you read this, the truth will be known. The documentary transitions to media vans parked outside the Pine Ridge Courthouse. Reporters deliver stand-ups as curious townspeople gather. Within 48 hours, what began as a local tragedy had become a national conversation, the narrator explains. Cable news channels debated not just the crime itself, but the broader questions it raised about disclosure, deception, and the boundaries of privacy in intimate relationships. A montage of news headlines appears. Small-town murder exposes identity secret. Husband claims deception defense in wife's murder. Transgender victims past at center of murder case. Pine Ridge divided, murder case sparks debate. The documentary shows Pine Ridge residents being interviewed on the courthouse steps. Their responses reveal deep divisions. Margaret Wilson, 67, church organist. This isn't the James Mercer I've known for 40 years. Something broke inside him. It doesn't excuse what he did, but I understand his sense of betrayal. Kyle Jennings, 29, high school teacher. What happened to Diane Mercer was a hate crime, plain and simple. Her private medical history was nobody's business but her own. The documentary cuts to District Attorney Melinda Hargrove at a press conference. The state will be pursuing first-degree murder charges. The evidence points clearly to premeditation and intent. Mr. Mercer had ample time to process his feelings and seek help. Instead, he chose violence. The defense attorney, Richard Galloway, is shown leaving the courthouse, swarmed by reporters. My client experienced an extreme emotional disturbance that would have overwhelmed any reasonable person's capacity for self-control. We will be pursuing a defense centered on this psychological reality. The documentary transitions to Diane's apartment, now sealed with police tape. Officer Henderson stands outside. Investigators searched Diane Mercer's residence looking for any evidence that might shed light on the case. What they found instead was a life meticulously documented. Photo albums, career awards, community service certificates, the ordinary evidence of a life well lived. The camera shows framed photos inside Diane's apartment. Diane with clients at house closings, Diane receiving a Chamber of Commerce award, Diane and James on their honeymoon in Bermuda. Patricia Alvarez returns to the screen. After her transition, Diane made a conscious choice to live what we call a stealth life, meaning she didn't publicly identify as transgender. This wasn't about deception. It was about finally living authentically as the woman she always was. The documentary cuts to legal expert Professor Meredith Chen. There's an emerging body of case law around what's called transgender panic defense. The claim that discovering someone is transgender provokes such extreme emotional distress that it mitigates culpability for violent acts. Most legal experts reject this concept, but it persists in our courts. The screen shows Thomas Blake sitting alone on a park bench, his face in his hands. 3 days after the murder, Thomas Blake attempted suicide in his Philadelphia apartment. He left a note that read simply, "I never meant for this to happen." Hospital footage shows Thomas recovering, a police officer stationed outside his room. The documentary transitions to James Mercer's preliminary hearing. He sits beside his attorney, still showing little emotion as evidence is presented. The prosecutor displays text messages from James's phone, sent to his sister Karen hours before the murder. "I gave her everything, my trust, my life, and it was all based on a lie. How can I ever trust anything again when the person closest to me could hide something so fundamental? By tomorrow, this will all be over." The defense introduces records of James's emergency appointment with Dr. Wright, arguing it demonstrates his deteriorating mental state and attempts to seek help. The documentary cuts to Dr. Wright, who carefully navigates professional confidentiality. Without breaking confidence, I can say that acute crisis situations often present as a narrowing of perspective. Options that would normally be visible become invisible. The person sees only one path forward. The screen shows Diane's funeral in Philadelphia. Patricia Alvarez and other support group members stand alongside Diane's elderly mother, who appears bewildered by the media attention. Patricia speaks softly. Diane always feared her past would catch up with her. Not because she was ashamed, she'd worked through that, but because she knew how cruel the world could be. In her final text to me, she wrote, "I'm going to tell him everything tonight. Pray for me." The documentary returns to Pine Ridge, where a small memorial of flowers has appeared outside Keystone Realty. Linda Parsons arranges a framed photo of Diane on what was her desk. The Diane I knew was kind, professional, and private. Whether she should have told James about her past isn't for me to judge, but no one deserves to die for keeping a secret. The documentary shows Officer Henderson reviewing forensic reports. The timeline we've constructed indicates James and Diane talked for approximately 90 minutes before the violence began. Based on physical evidence, there was initially a heated argument, broken glass, overturned furniture, followed by a period where things appeared to calm down. Wine glasses on the nightstand suggest they even shared a drink. Forensic psychologist Dr. Marcus Reed appears on screen. This pattern is common in intimate partner homicides. There's often a deceptive calm before the violence, a moment where the victim believes the crisis has passed, that understanding has been reached. The documentary cuts to James's truck being processed by forensic technicians. In the glove compartment, they find a small velvet jewelry box containing Diane's wedding ring. Officer Henderson explains, "We believe James demanded Diane's ring during their confrontation, symbolically ending their marriage before he killed her." The screen shows James in his jail cell, writing in a journal. The narrator explains that James has begun documenting his thoughts, excerpts of which would later become part of the court record. "I didn't kill her because of what she was. I killed her because everything we had was fiction. 3 years of my life erased. When someone steals your reality, what crime is it to take theirs?" The documentary cuts to Dr. Wright. The fundamental issue here isn't about gender identity. It's about a profound sense of betrayal. James Mercer believed his entire marriage was built on deception. In his mind, he'd been robbed not just of an honest relationship, but of his own agency and identity as a husband. Patricia Alvarez offers a counterpoint. Diane didn't deceive James about who she was, her soul, her character, her love for him. She withheld information about who she had been, out of fear of exactly this reaction. The tragic irony is that her fear was justified. The documentary shows competing vigils in Pine Ridge, one outside the courthouse for Diane, focusing on transgender rights and acceptance, another at the First Presbyterian Church, focusing on prayer for both victim and perpetrator. The screen fades to black as the narrator concludes. As James Mercer awaited trial, Pine Ridge remained divided over questions with no easy answers. What do we owe those we love in terms of disclosure? Where is the line between privacy and deception? And can understanding the complexity of human identity ever mitigate the taking of a human life? The Pine Ridge County Courthouse stands solemn against a gray October sky, 6 months after Diane Mercer's murder. News vans line the street as journalists from across the country prepare for the verdict in Commonwealth v. James Mercer. The narrator's voice guides viewers through the scene. After 14 days of testimony, 47 witnesses, and 11 hours of jury deliberation, the moment of judgment had arrived for James Mercer and, in many ways, for Pine Ridge itself. Inside the courtroom, cameras capture James Mercer sitting beside his attorney. He appears thinner than in previous footage, his expression inscrutable. The gallery is divided. Diane's supporters on one side, James's on the other, with court officers stationed between them. Judge Eleanor Martinez addresses the courtroom. "I'll remind everyone that no outbursts will be tolerated regardless of the verdict. This case has already seen enough emotion." The jury files in, none making eye contact with either the defendant or the gallery. The foreman hands a folded paper to the bailiff, who delivers it to the judge. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Martinez instructs. James stands slowly, his handcuffs jingling in the hushed courtroom. In the matter of Commonwealth versus James Mercer, on the charge of murder in the first degree, the jury finds the defendant. The documentary freezes this moment, rewinding to 3 weeks earlier, the first day of trial. District Attorney Melinda Hargrove stands before the jury box, her opening statement crisp and measured. This case is about choices. When James Mercer learned something that upset him deeply about his wife, he had choices. He could have filed for divorce. He could have sought counseling. He could have simply walked away. Instead, he chose to end Diane Mercer's life with premeditated brutality. The documentary shows evidence presented by the prosecution. The razor blades, the duct tape, the security footage of James methodically making purchases before driving to the motel. The prosecution's case centered on establishing premeditation, the narrator explains. They meticulously traced James Mercer's actions in the 24 hours leading to the murder, arguing each step demonstrated calculated intent rather than sudden passion. Dr. Maya Patel returns to present forensic findings. The wounds on the victim's body showed two distinct patterns: defensive wounds on the arms and hands, suggesting she fought back initially, and the fatal wounds to the neck and torso that were delivered with precision, indicating the attacker was in control of his actions. The documentary cuts to defense attorney Richard Galloway's opening statement. The law recognizes that human beings can be pushed beyond their capacity for rational thought. James Mercer didn't just discover his wife had kept a secret. He discovered his entire marriage was founded on a fundamental deception that shattered his sense of reality. The defense strategy unfolds on screen. Expert witnesses testifying about identity deception trauma, James's clean prior record, and his immediate confession showing remorse. Dr. Vincent Kelly, forensic psychiatrist for the defense, appears on screen. Mr. Mercer experienced what we call ego-dystonic rage, a violent reaction when one's sense of self is severely threatened. In that moment, he was incapable of distinguishing right from wrong in any meaningful sense. The prosecution counters with its own expert, Dr. Samantha Rivera. Feeling betrayed, even profoundly betrayed, does not meet the clinical threshold for temporary insanity or diminished capacity. Mr. Mercer's actions, purchasing weapons, driving to the motel, waiting in his truck, all demonstrate awareness and intent. The documentary shows Thomas Blake taking the stand, visibly nervous, his wrists still bandaged from his suicide attempt. "I just wanted money," he testifies, voice breaking. "I thought if he knew why she wouldn't help me, maybe he would. I never thought he'd hurt her." Under cross-examination, Thomas admits, "Diane called me from the motel. She said James was coming over that night. She was going to explain everything, show him old photos, tell him about her life before. She thought if he understood her journey, he might forgive her." The courtroom falls silent as the prosecution plays James's 911 call. "Dispatcher, 911, what's your emergency?" James, voice flat, emotionless. "I need to report a murder at the Pine Ridge Motel, room 14. Dispatcher, sir, who's been hurt?" James, "My wife, Diane Mercer. I killed her." The documentary cuts to Patricia Alvarez testifying through tears. Diane lived in fear that her past would be exposed, not because she was ashamed, but because she knew how the world treats transgender women. Her greatest fear was that someone she loved would look at her differently once they knew. In a dramatic moment, the defense calls James Mercer himself to testify, a risky strategy that surprised legal observers. On the stand, James speaks quietly but clearly. "I loved her. I thought I knew her. Finding out our entire relationship was built on a lie. It was like I'd been living in a simulation for 3 years. Nothing was real." The prosecutor's cross-examination is surgical. "Yet you had the presence of mind to purchase razor blades and duct tape, to drive to the motel, to wait 20 minutes in your truck. Those sound like the actions of someone making choices, Mr. Mercer." James replies, "I don't remember making those choices. I remember feeling like I was watching myself from a distance, like someone else was driving." The documentary shows the jury during closing arguments, their expressions unreadable as both sides make final appeals. As the trial concludes, the documentary returns to present day, with Judge Martinez reading the verdict. "Guilty of murder in the second degree." A collective gasp ripples through the courtroom. James closes his eyes briefly, then reopens them, his expression unchanged. Legal analyst Raj Patel explains to viewers, by finding James Mercer guilty of second-degree rather than first-degree murder, the jury rejected the prosecution's argument of premeditation while still holding him responsible for an intentional killing. Essentially, they determined that while he intended to kill Diane, he did not plan it in advance. The documentary cuts to the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later. Judge Martinez addresses James directly. "Mr. Mercer, this court recognizes the emotional trauma you experienced. However, no betrayal, no deception, no shock justifies taking another human life. Diane Mercer's right to live outweighed your right to feel deceived. She sentences him to 18 years in prison. Outside the courthouse, reactions from Pine Ridge residents reveal a community still divided, but beginning to heal. Margaret Wilson, who earlier expressed sympathy for James, now speaks more solemnly. Justice was done. Maybe not perfect justice. Is there such a thing? But something we can live with as a community. Kyle Jennings, the high school teacher, nods thoughtfully. The verdict acknowledges both the crime's severity and the complex human emotions involved. I hope it brings some peace to Diane's loved ones. The documentary follows up with key figures 1 year after the verdict. Patricia Alvarez stands outside a community center in Philadelphia. We established the Diane Mercer Foundation to support transgender individuals in small communities, focusing on healthcare, legal services, and safety resources. Her death won't be meaningless if it helps others live more safely. Thomas Blake is shown volunteering at a crisis hotline. I'll never forgive myself for my role in what happened. All I can do now is try to prevent other tragedies. Dr. Eleanor Wright speaks from her office in Pine Ridge. Our community has been forced to have difficult conversations about acceptance, privacy, and how we respond to information that challenges our worldview. It's painful, but necessary growth. The documentary shows James Mercer in prison, attending a group therapy session, then writing letters in his cell. According to prison officials, James Mercer has become a model inmate, participating in anger management and grief counseling programs. He declined to be interviewed for this documentary, but provided a written statement. The statement appears on screen. Nothing I can say will bring Diane back or justify what I did. I reacted to feeling deceived by committing the ultimate deception, convincing myself that taking a life could somehow restore what I'd lost. I was wrong. I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand not just who Diane was, but who I became in that motel room. The documentary concludes with a dual memorial, the simple headstone marking Diane Mercer's grave in Philadelphia, and a small garden dedicated in her memory in Pine Ridge Park, where residents from both sides of the divided town have begun to gather. The narrator offers a final reflection. The tragedy of Room 14 offers no easy lessons. It reminds us that human identity is both deeply personal and inevitably social, that our secrets and truths exist in relation to others. It forces us to ask what we owe to those we love, complete disclosure or acceptance without condition. And it compels us to examine how quickly understanding can collapse into violence when we feel our reality has been undermined. The camera pans across Pine Ridge as lights begin to come on in windows at dusk. In this small Pennsylvania town, 2 lives were destroyed in a single night. One ended by violence, the other condemned by justice. What remains is a community trying to find its way forward, asking itself the question at the heart of this tragedy: how well can we ever truly know one another?